Sometimes the most dangerous thing in America isn't what you did, it's who they think you are. At 2:13 a.m., the first red light slid across Naomi Carter's living room wall like a warning from another world. Then came the second, and the third. Within seconds, the quiet street in South Atlanta looked less like a neighborhood and more like a lockdown crime scene. 10 police cruisers crawled into position around her small brick house, their headlights cutting through the humid Georgia night, while radios crackled beneath the sound of barking dogs and distant thunder. Porch lights flicked on one by one up the block. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened halfway. People stared without speaking. Naomi stood frozen near the hallway, still wearing dark blue scrubs from her hospital shift, one hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter while the other held a paper cup of water she'd forgotten to drink. Her mother's oxygen machine hummed softly from the bedroom down the hall. Then a voice exploded through a loudspeaker outside. "Naomi Carter, step outside immediately." The paper cup slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. Water spread slowly across the tile. Another voice followed, sharper this time. "We know you're inside." Naomi swallowed hard and glanced toward the bedroom, where her mother slept beneath 2 blankets despite the summer heat. The old woman had finally fallen asleep less than an hour ago after another difficult night coughing. Naomi's chest tightened. She moved carefully to the front window and lifted the curtain just enough to see outside. Red and blue lights pulsed across her lawn. Officers stood beside their vehicles with rigid posture, hands near their belts, faces unreadable beneath rotating lights. At the center of the street stood a tall white man in a gray police jacket speaking calmly into a radio. Captain Ethan Wallace. Even from inside the house, Naomi recognized the cold confidence in the way he stood, like he had already decided who she was before ever speaking to her. Another command blasted through the speaker. "Step outside with your hands visible." Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Her pulse pounded so hard she could hear it. In her ears. Just 12 hours earlier, she had been helping an elderly patient eat soup at Mercy General Hospital. She had spent her night changing 4 bags, checking heart monitors, comforting frightened families, and holding the hand of a dying veteran whose own children never came to visit him. Now 10 police cars surrounded her home like she was some kind of threat. She looked down at herself. Faded scrubs, white nursing shoes, a hospital badge still hanging from her pocket. None of it mattered tonight. Outside, a neighbor slowly stepped onto his porch holding a coffee mug, staring directly toward Naomi's house. Across the street, someone began recording with a cell phone. Naomi could already feel the judgment spreading through the neighborhood faster than facts ever could. The loudspeaker cracked again. "Final warning, Ms. Carter." The words echoed against the wet pavement. Naomi inhaled slowly, forcing herself to move. She reached for the front doorknob with trembling fingers while thunder rolled low across the sky above Atlanta. And as the locks clicked open one by one, every flashing light outside suddenly turned toward her front door. Naomi stepped onto the porch with both hands raised slightly away from her body, her heart pounding beneath the thin fabric of her scrubs while humid night air wrapped around her skin like warm rain. The flashing lights made everything feel unreal. Red, blue, red again. The colors rolled across her face, her front yard, even the small flower pots she had planted with her mother 2 summers ago before the hospital bills started swallowing most of her paycheck. "Walk forward slowly," an officer ordered. Naomi obeyed without argument, carefully stepping down the porch stairs in worn white nursing shoes still marked with faint gray stains from a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. Her body ached from exhaustion. She had spent all evening on her feet helping patients recover from surgeries, calming frightened children in the emergency room, and sitting beside an elderly veteran who had cried quietly because he thought everyone had forgotten him. Naomi had stayed 20 extra minutes after clocking out just to make sure he was asleep before she left. That was who she was. The kind of woman who skipped meals to buy medicine for her mother. The kind of woman who knew the names of homeless people near the bus stop because she carried extra sandwiches in her bag after work. But none of those things mattered beneath police lights. Captain Ethan Wallace watched her approach with cold eyes that never softened. He stood near the hood of his cruiser with rain beginning to collect on the shoulders of his jacket. "Where is he?" he asked flatly. Naomi blinked in confusion. "I do not know what you are talking about." Ethan glanced briefly toward another officer before looking back at her. We received information that a fugitive entered this property tonight. Naomi stared at him, stunned. There is nobody here except my mother. Her voice remained calm, but inside she could already feel something heavier than fear settling into her chest. It was the familiar exhaustion of being judged before speaking. The same feeling she had known since high school security guards followed her through stores. Since landlords questioned whether she could really afford rent despite working full-time. Since patients at the hospital sometimes assumed she was janitorial staff instead of their nurse. Ethan stepped closer. Then you will not mind if we search the home. Naomi hesitated for half a second and glanced back toward the front window glowing softly behind her. Her mother was 72 years old and connected to an oxygen concentrator every night. Loud noises confused her since the stroke last winter. My mother is sleeping, Naomi said quietly. Please lower your voices. One young officer near the driveway smirked slightly as if her request annoyed him. Ethan did not react at all. Do you have something to hide? He asked. Naomi looked directly into his eyes for the first time. The street had gone almost completely silent except for police radios and distant thunder rolling over the city skyline. Several neighbors were still watching from their porches now. One woman across the street slowly shook her head in disappointment without even knowing the truth. Naomi felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused to let herself break. I work at Mercy General Hospital, she said softly. I just came home from taking care of people all night. My mother is sick inside that house. That is all there is here. Ethan's expression never changed. Rain began falling harder now, tapping against police hoods and soaking the edges of Naomi's sleeves while flashing lights reflected across the wet pavement like broken glass. Captain Ethan Wallace had spent 23 years wearing a badge, and somewhere during those years, the line between caution and judgment had quietly disappeared inside him. He stood in the rain with one hand resting near his radio while officers waited for his next command, and in his mind, this night was already simple. Somebody had tipped dispatch about a fugitive hiding in the neighborhood. The address belonged to a black woman living alone in a lower-income part of South Atlanta. To Ethan, that was enough to justify suspicion before evidence ever arrived. He glanced toward Naomi again as water dripped from the edge of his jacket collar. She did not look dangerous. She looked exhausted. But Ethan had long ago stopped seeing exhaustion in people like her. He saw resistance, evasion, excuses. Search team ready, he asked without taking his eyes off the house. An officer beside him nodded immediately. Naomi folded her arms tightly against the cold rain soaking through her scrubs. Captain, you still have not shown me a warrant. Ethan finally looked directly at her again. We are responding to an active investigation. That is not a warrant. Her voice remained respectful, but steady enough to irritate him. Around them, more neighbors had gathered beneath porches and carports despite the late hour. The entire street felt suspended in tension. Ethan noticed cell phones pointed toward the scene now. He hated cameras, hated public hesitation even more. His jaw tightened slightly. Ma'am, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, breathing slowly the same way she did while calming panicked patients in the emergency room. She could feel humiliation settling over the neighborhood like fog, not because she had done anything wrong, but because once police arrived in numbers like this, people stopped asking questions. They assumed guilt first. Across the lawn, one officer shined a flashlight toward Naomi's windows even though every light inside the house was already on. Another quietly laughed with his partner while glancing toward her mother's old pickup truck parked crooked near the curb. Ethan noticed everything. The cracked fence, the aging roof, the tiny house squeezed between newer remodeled homes. In his mind, places like this always carried trouble. He had built his career believing instinct mattered more than explanation. Sir, a younger officer said carefully as he approached Ethan from behind. Dispatch still has not confirmed visual on the suspect. Ethan barely reacted. He is here, but we do not actually know that yet. Ethan turned slowly toward the rookie. You questioning my call? The officer immediately straightened. No, sir. Silence returned except for rainfall tapping against metal hoods and distant thunder echoing over the city skyline. Naomi stood motionless beneath flashing lights while cold water rolled down her face. Her hands trembled slightly now, though she tried to hide it. Inside the house, Her mother's oxygen machine continued its soft mechanical rhythm through the open screen door. Ethan glanced toward the sound with visible annoyance. Who else is inside? My mother, Naomi answered quietly. She cannot handle stress well after her stroke. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then toward the dark hallway beyond the front door. Convenient, he muttered under his breath. Naomi heard it anyway. Something painful flickered across her face before disappearing again beneath composure. She realized then that nothing she said tonight would matter. Not her hospital badge, not her job, not her years caring for strangers. To Ethan Wallace, she was already the version of her he had chosen to believe. Rainwater pooled near Naomi's shoes while blue and red lights continued spinning across the soaked street, washing her small home in the colors of suspicion. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes on her now. Neighbors stood under porch roofs holding coffee mugs and phones while rain drifted sideways beneath the flashing lights. Somewhere down the block, a child whispered a question that nobody answered. Captain Ethan Wallace remained near the center cruiser, unmoving, confident that pressure alone would eventually break her composure. Naomi wrapped her arms tighter around herself against the cold and looked once more toward the front door of her house. Through the screen, she could still hear the soft mechanical rhythm of her mother's oxygen machine. That sound grounded her. It reminded her who she was before this night tried turning her into something else. Ethan stepped forward again. Last chance, Miss Carter. Either we search voluntarily, or this becomes a very different situation. Naomi slowly lifted her chin. Rainwater slid down the side of her face, but her voice stayed calm. Then show me the legal paperwork. One officer exhaled sharply in frustration. Another adjusted his flashlight toward the house again. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He was not used to resistance spoken this quietly. Most people either panicked or argued. Naomi did neither. She simply stood there in soaked nursing scrubs, asking for the same rights anyone else would want in the middle of the night. You are interfering with an investigation, Ethan said coldly. No, Naomi answered softly. I am protecting my home. The street fell silent again. Even the officers nearby seemed to pause for half a second at the steadiness in her voice. Naomi knew she looked small standing there alone against an entire line of police vehicles. She knew the image already forming in people's minds. A black woman surrounded by law enforcement after midnight. To most viewers, that alone created suspicion. But Naomi also knew fear could make people surrender pieces of themselves they would never get back. Her mother had taught her that years ago. Never let humiliation convince you that you are wrong for existing, she used to say. Ethan took another step closer until only a few feet separated them. Rain tapped steadily against his jacket while red and blue lights swept across his face in slow waves. Do not mistake patience for weakness, he warned. Naomi looked directly at him. And do not mistake dignity for guilt. The words landed harder than shouting would have. A few officers exchanged glances. One older neighbor quietly lowered her phone, suddenly uncertain about what she was watching anymore. Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned slightly toward his officers. Prepare entry. Naomi's breath caught for the first time all night. Two officers immediately moved toward the porch while another adjusted his gloves. The sound of boots splashing through shallow rainwater echoed across the lawn. Please, Naomi said quickly, finally letting emotion slip into her voice. My mother is sick. You are frightening her. As if summoned by the words, a weak cough suddenly drifted from inside the house. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Ethan heard it too, but his expression did not soften. Then cooperate, he replied. Naomi stared at him for a long moment, realizing there would be no mercy in this conversation because mercy required seeing her humanity first. Behind Ethan, the police lights continued spinning across the wet neighborhood while thunder rolled lower now, closer than before. Naomi slowly reached into the pocket of her scrubs. Instantly, several officers stiffened. Easy, one warned sharply. Naomi carefully pulled out an old cell phone with a cracked corner and held it up where everyone could see. I am calling someone, she said quietly. Ethan folded his arms. A lawyer? Naomi looked down at the glowing screen for a second before answering. No. Then she pressed one contact and lifted the phone to her ear while rain continued falling around her like the whole city was holding its breath. The line rang only once before a man answered. Talk to me. His voice was low, calm, and completely awake. Naomi turned slightly away from the officers as rain rolled down the back of her neck. "I am sorry to call this late," she whispered. For the first time all night, her voice sounded tired instead of controlled. "They are outside my house." Silence waited on the other end for half a second. Then the man spoke again, slower this time. "Who is outside?" Naomi looked toward the police cruisers surrounding her lawn. Flashing lights reflected across puddles like shattered glass. "Police." Another pause. "Are you safe?" Naomi glanced toward the front window where her mother's bedroom light had suddenly turned on. A shadow moved weakly behind the curtain. Her chest tightened immediately. "For now," she answered quietly. Captain Ethan Wallace watched her from several feet away with growing impatience. "You done?" he asked sharply. Naomi ignored him. "I did not know who else to call," she said softly into the phone. The man on the line exhaled once. "Naomi." The way he said her name carried history behind it. Trust. Respect. "Listen carefully to me. Do not argue with them. Do not panic. I am coming." Ethan stepped closer the moment the call ended. "Who was that?" Naomi lowered the phone slowly. "Someone who knows me." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "That should comfort you." Before Naomi could answer, movement inside the house caught her attention again. Her mother had reached the hallway now, one fragile hand against the wall for support, while oxygen tubing trailed behind her. "Mama, stay inside." Naomi called immediately, fear breaking through her composure. But the older woman looked confused by the lights and voices outside. "Naomi," she asked weakly through the screen door. Several officers turned toward the doorway at once. Ethan rubbed rainwater from his forehead with visible irritation. "Ma'am, return inside the residence." Naomi moved instinctively toward the porch. "She is recovering from a stroke. Please let me help her." Ethan hesitated only briefly before nodding toward an officer near the stairs. "Escort her." Naomi climbed the wet porch steps quickly, taking her mother gently by the arm before she could lose balance. Up close, her mother's breathing sounded uneven beneath the soft hiss of the oxygen machine. "What is happening?" the old woman whispered. Naomi forced herself to smile despite the humiliation burning through her chest. "Everything is okay, Mama." But outside, nothing felt okay anymore. The entire neighborhood was watching. Cell phone cameras still pointed toward the house. Police radios crackled nonstop beneath rolling thunder. Ethan glanced at his watch, then toward the officers waiting for orders near the front gate. He was growing tired of delays. "Captain," the younger officer from earlier said cautiously, "maybe we should wait for confirmation from dispatch before escalating." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "You want to tell the chief tomorrow that we let a suspect walk because we got nervous?" The rookie fell silent. Ethan turned back toward Naomi as she carefully settled her mother into a chair near the doorway. "This ends tonight," he said coldly. Naomi looked at him from beneath rain-soaked curls sticking against her forehead. "It should never have started." Ethan ignored the comment completely. He motioned toward two officers standing near the cruisers. "Begin perimeter sweep." Naomi's stomach dropped as officers spread farther around the property, flashlights cutting through windows and fences while neighbors whispered from the sidewalks. Her mother watched the scene with frightened eyes, clutching a thin blanket around her shoulders. Naomi knelt beside her gently despite the cold rain soaking through her knees. "Breathe slow for me," she whispered, "just like the doctor taught you." Then somewhere far down the street, beyond the sound of rain and police radios, Naomi heard the low growl of an engine approaching fast through the darkness. The sound of the approaching engine faded almost as quickly as Naomi noticed it, swallowed again by rain and distant thunder. No vehicle appeared around the corner. No headlights cut through the darkness. Just silence returning slowly over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket settling across the street. Naomi remained kneeling beside her mother near the doorway, while police flashlights continued moving across fences and windows outside. For a moment, doubt crept quietly into her chest. Maybe he was too far away. Maybe he could not get here in time. Captain Ethan Wallace checked his watch again with visible impatience. "Enough of this," he muttered. The younger officer beside him shifted uneasily. "Sir, dispatch still cannot verify the suspect entered the residence." Ethan's eyes hardened instantly, and dispatch was not standing here when the witness called. The rookie looked toward Naomi sitting beside her frightened mother. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the porch roof now, forming shallow puddles across the concrete steps. The whole scene no longer looked dangerous. It looked sad. Ethan pointed toward the house. Finish the sweep. Officers moved farther around the property, while neighbors continued watching in complete silence. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly. Her body felt heavy from exhaustion. She had not eaten since noon. Her scrubs clung cold against her skin. Every flashing light across the lawn made her mother flinch. Yet somehow the deepest pain was not fear anymore. It was knowing how easily dignity could disappear once enough people decided you did not deserve it. Her mother reached for her hand with trembling fingers. Naomi, she whispered weakly, what did we do? Naomi swallowed hard before answering. Nothing. The old woman nodded slowly, but confusion still clouded her tired eyes. She had grown up during another era of America, an era where men with authority often arrived before truth did. Naomi remembered stories her mother used to tell quietly at the dinner table when she was little. Stories about neighbors stopped for no reason. About jobs denied without explanation. About learning to stay calm because anger only made people see danger where there was none. Naomi used to think those days belonged to history books. But standing beneath police lights tonight, she suddenly understood how fear could survive through generations without ever changing its face. Ethan approached the porch again, stopping at the bottom of the steps. Ms. Carter, he said firmly, if someone enters this property and interferes with an active investigation, they will be detained as well. Naomi slowly stood to face him. Water dripped from loose curls framing her exhausted face, while the oxygen machine hissed softly behind her. You still have no warrant, she answered quietly. Ethan folded his arms. And you still have not explained why your address was connected to a fugitive report. Naomi stared at him for a long moment before speaking. Because sometimes people see a black woman living alone and decide. That is explanation enough. Several officers nearby looked away immediately. Ethan's expression darkened. Careful. Naomi did not respond. She was too tired to argue anymore. Rain continued falling steadily, while red and blue lights washed across the neighborhood over and over again, turning ordinary homes into something cold and unfamiliar. Across the street, one neighbor slowly lowered her phone, shame beginning to replace curiosity on her face. Then suddenly a sharp voice crackled through Ethan's radio. Captain Wallace, incoming vehicle approaching perimeter at high speed. Ethan grabbed the radio instantly. Unit identify. The response came back tense this time. Black SUV. No plates visible from distance. Officers immediately straightened across the lawn. Flashlights shifted toward the far end of the street. Naomi felt her pulse quicken again as headlights finally appeared through the rain, cutting slowly through the darkness toward the barricade of police cruisers, while the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The black SUV rolled slowly through the rain until it stopped directly behind the last police cruiser blocking the street. Its headlights remained on, cutting bright white beams across wet pavement and flashing badges. For a moment, nobody moved. Officers exchanged uncertain looks while Captain Ethan Wallace stepped forward with visible irritation. Identify the driver, he ordered sharply into his radio. The SUV engine shut off. Rain tapped steadily against the roof while the neighborhood stood completely still. Even the people watching from porches seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Then the driver's door opened. A tall black man stepped out wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, broad shoulders filling the rain-soaked silence around him. He did not rush. He did not speak immediately. He simply closed the vehicle door and looked calmly at the scene in front of him. Naomi felt her chest loosen for the first time all night. Ethan studied the man carefully. Mid-40s maybe. Clean posture. Controlled movements. The kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside without understanding why. One officer near the barricade lowered his flashlight almost immediately. The man walked forward through the rain with steady calm until an officer blocked his path. Sir, this is an active police investigation. The man reached slowly into his jacket pocket, removed a leather credential holder, and opened it beneath the cruiser lights. The officer's posture changed instantly. Captain, he called out uneasily. Ethan approached with annoyance already visible on his face. Who are you? The man closed the credential holder calmly. Darius Kane. Ethan waited for more. When none came, his irritation deepened. And why exactly are you here? Darius looked past Ethan toward Naomi, standing beside her mother on the porch. Rain slid down his face, but his expression never changed. Because she called me. Naomi's mother quietly covered her mouth with trembling fingers the moment she recognized him. Lord, she whispered under her breath. Ethan folded his arms. Mr. Kane, unless you're a legal counsel, I suggest you stay out of police operations. Darius finally looked directly at him. The street seemed to grow quieter somehow under that stare. You surrounded the home of a decorated trauma nurse with 10 cruisers in the middle of the night based on an unverified tip. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. You do not know what information we have. Actually, Darius answered calmly, I know exactly how this looks. A few officers shifted uncomfortably nearby. Ethan took another step forward. And what exactly qualifies you to interfere here? Darius reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a second identification card. He handed it over without a word. Ethan glanced down casually at first, then froze almost imperceptibly. The rain continued falling around them, while flashing lights reflected across the plastic badge in his hands. Federal clearance. Military credentials. Special operations designation. Ethan looked back up slowly. Navy SEAL. Darius took the identification back. Retired. The younger rookie officer stared openly now, while several others exchanged nervous glances. The entire mood on the street shifted without anyone saying it aloud. Darius turned toward Naomi again. Are you hurt? Naomi shook her head softly. No. Her voice almost cracked from exhaustion. Darius noticed immediately. His eyes moved toward her soaked scrubs, then toward her frightened mother sitting beside the oxygen machine near the doorway. Something hardened quietly in his expression then. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind carried by someone who had seen too much injustice to still be surprised by it. Ethan straightened his posture again, trying to reclaim control of the moment. Mr. Kane, with all due respect, this situation does not concern you. Darius looked at him for a long second before answering. Captain Wallace, he said calmly. Naomi Carter once carried wounded men through falling concrete and smoke while most people were running the opposite direction. Silence swallowed the entire street. Even the rain suddenly seemed quieter. So trust me when I say this concerns me very personally. Captain Ethan Wallace said nothing for several seconds. Rain continued sliding down his jacket while the flashing lights around him suddenly felt less powerful than before. Darius Kane stood calmly in the middle of the street, unmoved by the tension surrounding him. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. Somehow that made the silence heavier. Naomi remained beside her mother on the porch, exhausted eyes fixed on Darius while cold rainwater dripped from her sleeves onto the wooden steps below. Ethan finally cleared his throat. You are saying Ms. Carter served overseas? Darius looked at him steadily. Volunteer Trauma Response Unit attached to military medical operations outside Fallujah. Several officers nearby exchanged confused looks. Ethan frowned slightly. She was military? No, Darius answered. She was brave. The words landed quietly, but harder than accusation. Darius stepped forward one pace, his voice calm beneath the rainfall. The night I met Naomi Carter, half the building around us was collapsing from explosions nearby. Smoke everywhere. Power gone. Men screaming for medics. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately, uncomfortable hearing those memories spoken aloud. Darius continued anyway. Most people were trying to escape. Naomi was carrying wounded soldiers out one by one because she refused to leave anyone behind. Ethan glanced toward Naomi instinctively. It was the first time all night he had truly looked at her instead of through her. The soaked nursing scrubs, the tired face, the quiet composure. Suddenly none of it matched the suspicion he had built in his head. Darius reached into his jacket pocket slowly and removed a small silver challenge coin worn smooth along the edges from years of handling. He held it toward Ethan beneath the flashing police lights. Every man in my unit carries one of these. Ethan hesitated before taking it. The engraved insignia reflected blue and red across his fingers. Naomi earned hers after saving 6 American lives in under 12 minutes. The younger rookie officer stared openly now. Another officer nearby lowered his head slightly in visible discomfort. Ethan looked back toward Naomi, standing silently beside her elderly mother. Rainwater traced down her face while the oxygen machine hissed softly through the open doorway behind her. She looked nothing like the threat he had imagined when dispatch first called. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life carrying burdens quietly while people underestimated her. Darius spoke again, softer this time. Do you know what she did after coming home? Ethan remained silent. Worked double shifts at a public hospital. Took care of her mother after the stroke. Paid medical bills nobody else helped with. Darius gestured calmly toward the line of police cruisers crowding the narrow street. And tonight, after all that service, this is what she gets. The words cut deeper because they were true. Across the neighborhood, several neighbors slowly lowered their phones. The mood had completely changed now. Curiosity had turned into embarrassment. One older woman on a nearby porch quietly shook her head with visible shame. Ethan handed the challenge coin back slowly, his face unreadable beneath rotating lights. For the first time all night, uncertainty entered his posture. His radio crackled suddenly at his shoulder. Captain Wallace, dispatch update. Original suspect vehicle was located 3 miles north. Repeat, suspect no longer connected to this address. Silence swallowed the street again. The rookie officer closed his eyes briefly. One officer near the sidewalk looked down at the wet pavement. Naomi did not react outwardly. She simply stood there in the rain holding her mother's trembling hand while 10 police cruisers idled around her small home for absolutely no reason. Ethan lowered the radio slowly from his mouth. The flashing lights reflected across his face now, but the confidence that had been there earlier was gone. Darius looked at him steadily for another long moment before speaking one final time. Captain, he said quietly, authority means nothing if you lose the ability to recognize humanity. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Rain continued falling softly across the neighborhood, while Captain Ethan Wallace stood in the middle of the street, holding silence where authority had been only moments before. The police radios still crackled. The emergency lights still turned slowly across wet pavement and quiet houses. But the energy behind them was gone now. One by one, officers began lowering their flashlights. Some avoided looking toward Naomi entirely. Others glanced toward their captain, waiting for instructions that suddenly felt much heavier than before. Ethan finally inhaled slowly and touched the radio near his shoulder. Stand down, he said quietly. The words barely carried above the rain, but every officer heard them. The perimeter dissolved almost immediately. Doors opened. Cruiser engines shifted. A few officers returned silently to their vehicles without speaking. The younger rookie hesitated near the sidewalk before looking toward Naomi. Ma'am, he said carefully, shame visible across his face. I am sorry. Naomi looked at him for a moment and simply nodded once. She was too exhausted for anger. Darius remained standing beside the porch, rainwater dripping from the edge of his jacket while he watched the street slowly return to normal. Ethan approached him slowly, every step carrying visible reluctance. For the first time all night, he looked older. Not weaker, just burdened by the realization that certainty had blinded him more than caution ever protected him. He stopped near the bottom of the porch steps and finally looked directly at Naomi. Ms. Carter, he began quietly. It appears mistakes were made tonight. Naomi said nothing. Ethan glanced briefly toward her frightened mother sitting beside the oxygen machine, then back toward the soaked scrubs Naomi still wore from her hospital shift. The image seemed impossible for him to escape now. I should not have assumed, he admitted carefully. The rain softened around them into a gentle, steady rhythm against rooftops and cruiser hoods. Naomi studied him silently for a long moment. Then, to Ethan's surprise, her voice remained calm. No, she said softly. You should not have. There was no anger in the words. Somehow that made them harder to hear. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before stepping back toward the street. He understood something now that no training course had ever taught him. Fear mixed with authority could turn ordinary people into suspects before truth even arrived. And once that happened, dignity became collateral damage. Darius finally walked up the porch steps toward Naomi. You okay? He asked quietly. Naomi looked at him and let out the first unsteady breath she had taken all night. I am now. Her mother reached toward Darius with trembling hands, and he gently took them both. You came fast, she whispered. Darius gave a small tired smile. She would have done the same for me. Down the street, police cruisers began pulling away one by one. The flashing lights slowly disappeared from house walls, windows, and puddles until darkness returned to the neighborhood again. Neighbors quietly stepped back inside their homes, carrying embarrassment heavier than gossip. Soon only rain remained. Naomi stood silently on the porch watching the final cruiser disappear around the corner. The street looked ordinary again, but something inside her felt permanently exhausted. Darius noticed the way her shoulders sagged now that survival no longer required strength. "You should get inside," he said softly. Naomi nodded. She carefully helped her mother stand. One arm wrapped gently around her shoulders as they moved toward the doorway together. Before entering, Naomi paused for a moment and looked back at the empty street glistening beneath distant streetlights. Hours earlier, those same streets had treated her like a threat. Now they stood silent, unable to return what had been taken from her tonight. Darius remained near the porch steps, while Naomi guided her mother back inside the small house. The oxygen machine resumed its quiet, steady rhythm through the darkness. Outside, the rain finally began to slow, and in the silence left behind after power had gone home, dignity remained standing exactly where it always had.